How do we kind of maintain nonprofits but resist nonprofitization? So maintain like the vital functions that some nonprofits are providing for communities without sort of internalizing the neoliberal funding logics and criminalization logics and all the other kinds of pieces of nonprofitization that we see as harmful to our communities.
Some of the work is about how to think deeply about violence prevention. So looking at what are the sources of violence in our communities. And this really ranges. People are doing violence prevention by trying to think about how to get police and ICE out of our communities, things like that. Try to reduce the tools that those systems have to bring violence in. People also do work to try to get there to be less guns in our communities, or to try to have people have build healthy relationship skills, doing deep education and leadership work inside schools with teenagers about what it means to build healthy relationships and to build healthy friendships, which tend to make people more resilient and less likely to be harmed inside intimate partner violence, right? There's also a lot of work around building systems of accountability in our communities. So when something really violent happens, and we know that calling the cops is often going to make things worse for folks, it's going to escalate the situation or bring new violence, what can we do? What else can we do? And so there's a lot of work around that. There's a work around sort of neighborhood-based solutions, like I'm thinking about the Audre Lorde Project, Safe Outside the System project, which has for years worked in a neighborhood in Brooklyn to try to get store owners to agree that they want to help solve violence in the community, that they can be a safe place for people to run if something's happening, that they won't bring the police into it, that trying to build relationships between local resources like shop owners and people who own the corner deli or who work in the corner deli, and folks in the community who are trying to deal with both homophobic and transphobic violence on the street and extreme police violence. So trying to find solutions like that, just like safe spaces to go, trying to build inside our communities real safety plans. So what does it mean to help each other, have places to go when we need to get away from a particular person or a particular situation?
Trying to figure out models that don't rely on criminalization and the state, but that take into account that deep isolation that survivors feel. And I think that's something that to me feels like a gap around, in terms of like some of the models that I think I've been using more actively in the last few years that are really drawing from community resources to support survivors and to think through accountability and punishment in different ways. I think the challenge is when you're really limited in what kind of community you can resource, what alternatives exist there. And so I think that's where I feel like nonprofits like Saki or other community-based organizations might have a role to play around facilitating and creating some of those alternative structures.
What does it mean to produce accountability systems where people who have been harmed can get deep support, and people who are doing harm can get support to not ever do the harm again? So that's a lot of the work, is figuring out, why does harm happen? A lot of times people who engage in harm have been survivors of harm themselves, or there's a lot going on in the situation. How do we get to the root cause of that and actually give people what they need to not do this harm again, whether that's deep understandings, whether that's mental health support, whether that's addressing deep stresses in people's lives or attitudes and beliefs about gender or other things, right? And so this kind of work, which is in a lot of different formats, right? There's people doing very local projects on this in communities all over.
Something that would be a million times more helpful than, say, calling an organization when violence is happening would be for us all to know how to respond to violence. And so if our neighbors knew how to take care of each other, then we wouldn't need this nonprofit to exist.
People are saying, well, how can we do accountability that's not reliant on the police? But to do that, you can't have this one model intervention program after an incident of violence, right? People see more and more, you need to build an accountability infrastructure, which essentially is about creating an alternative governance structure that can hold people accountable and kind of can be the basis for accountability. So I see that that's the direction that the work is going into, and that ultimately it ends up being about how can we kind of run things ourselves. I mean, if the system were to disappear tomorrow, we had nothing to replace it with. So how do we start to actually practice the things we would want to replace it with? How do we take this time to experiment, learn from each other, and say this is a different way we could run things that would be more equitable and just for everybody?
you.